Welcome to RIETI. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to RIETI. Today we welcome Dr. Ayhan KOSE from World Bank to make a presentation on the global economic prospects, which was made public in June. Dr. KOSE is the director of the Prospects Group, which is responsible for the global economic prospects, but is also an extensive writer on international macroeconomics and finance in his own right, including inflation in emerging and developing economies and collapse and revival, understanding global recessions and recovery. After that, we will ask Dr. Kunari Kimura from Keio University, one of the leading trade economists in Japan and chief economist at ERIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, to make some comments and pose some questions, after which we will have a discussion on the macroeconomic prospects in Asia and main risk scenarios, etc. Without further ado, Dr. KOSE, welcome, and thank you very much for making the time to come join us today. Please give your presentation.
Thank you, Osamu, and thank you for inviting me to join this event. I'm very happy to share the stage with Dr. Kimura. Obviously, global economy is going through a very difficult period. And in the latest Global Economic Prospects Report, we look at the state of the global economy and examine the short-term and long-term implications of the COVID-19 crisis. I'm going to go through a short presentation. So, in the latest report, Pandemic and Crisis, we examine this crisis from different perspectives. We look at the global implications, regional implications, short-term implications, and the long-term implications. We also analyze what will be the consequences for emerging market developing economies under certain scenarios. In today's presentation, I am going to focus on 3 points. One, short-term implications of the pandemic. The second one is the long-term implications of COVID-19. And the third one is about policy priorities. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to use this acronym EMDs, Emerging Market and Developing Economies. Let me start with the first point. What do we know about the short-term implications of the pandemic? Obviously, we are expecting a very serious recession. In fact, this is going to be the deepest and most synchronized global recession episode since the Second World War. For emerging market developing economies, they are going to experience the first recession on record. And risks are still tilted to the downside. So as much as the prospects look bleak, we should worry about possibility of further deterioration. Second important point I would like to make, there are long-term implications of the pandemic, and those implications in terms of growth are quite serious. We are expecting weaker potential output, weaker investment, and weaker productivity growth over the long term because of the pandemic. Policy priorities are clear. Policymakers need to address the immediate health crisis, start thinking about the post-crisis recovery, and of course, coordinate policies globally. Let me start with the first point. Global economy experienced crisis before, but never a crisis like this one over the past century. And as I mentioned, this crisis translated into a serious global recession. This year, global economy is going to contract by about 5.2%. In the case of advanced economies, we are expecting these economies to see growth declining relative to last year by more than 8 percentage points, what we were expecting, and contracting 7%. In the case of emerging market developed economies, there is going to be an outright recession by about 2.5% contraction. When it comes to regions, the story is also quite difficult to narrate. In almost all regions, you will see contractions, except East Asia Pacific. I'm going to discuss that a bit later. But when you look at, for example, Latin America and the Caribbean, a region that depends on trade, that depends on commodities, that depends on remittances, that depends on tourism revenues. And of course, we see collapse in every part of these factors I mentioned. This region will see a contraction more than 7% this year, and it will be the deepest contraction over the past 120 years for the region. Now, when you look at other regions, for example, a region like Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, they will all feel the impact of the health crisis and the economic crisis in different ways, but they will all see serious recessions. In the case of South Asia, a region that doesn't have any commodity exporter, there will be a contraction by about 2.7% as India experienced a serious recession. Next year, we are expecting growth coming back, but that growth will not be enough to cover the losses of this year. So the growth will be around 4.2% at the global level. And then in almost all regions, we will see growth coming back. So in the case of East Asia and Pacific, the story is a bit more optimistic for the region as a whole, primarily because of China's recovery. China is the only country, the major economy, we are expecting basically to deliver growth in 2020. That growth is now around 1%, but in light of recent developments, China growth number could surprise on the upside. If you take out China, the rest of the region will see a recession. This will be the first recession since the 1997-98 East Asian financial crisis for the region. So the region handled the pandemic so far reasonably well, and were able to contain the pandemic in almost all countries, even though in some countries number have been increasing recently. In the case of China, activity recovered in the second quarter, so growth came back. When you look at the manufacturing activity as well, now it is in the expansion territory. If you take out China from the emerging market developing economies in the region, of course, things look different in the sense that high frequency indicators still suggest a recession. So there is a difficult recovery ahead of all of these regions. China had the pandemic earlier and was able to contain, so it is ahead of others in terms of recovery, and of course it will lead the regional recovery in coming months. Now, it is important to put this global recession in historical context. When we think about global recessions and look at the history going back all the way to 1870, global economy experienced 14 global recessions. In each of these episodes, we saw a contraction in per capita global income. The 2020 global recession is the deepest episode since the Second World War, and the fourth deepest episode since 1870. The other three episodes were basically those that took place in 1914, 1930-32, the Great Depression, of course, and 1945-46. So two out of these three episodes were associated with world wars. So if you take out those two episodes, the 2020 episode is the most basically harmful and the deepest episode after Great Depression over the past 150 years. This episode is also exceptional in one other dimension. It is the only episode that has been triggered purely by a pandemic. This episode is the most synchronized in the sense that it will see largest share of economies experiencing contractions in per capita income this year. Even at the height of Great Depression, the share of economies experiencing contraction was lower than what we are going to see this year. So in all, this is a very difficult episode. Now, there are a number of risks ahead of us. I think two of them are critical. One is a more protracted pandemic. Let me talk about this risk a little bit. When you think about advanced economies basically were able to control the pandemic, all advanced economies except the United States. In the United States, of course, we saw significant increases in some states in recent months. And they changed the trajectory in terms of the evolution of the pandemic in this country. But if you look at daily new cases in emerging market developing economies, the story is different in the sense that the pandemic is still in full force. If you turn to the regions and look at the daily new cases, you also see in some regions more than the others, the pandemic is basically again in full force. For example, in Latin America, Caribbean, in South Asia region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Middle East, North Africa, we still have rising caseloads, and these regions, in terms of their health service capacity, in terms of testing capacity, really not at the levels of advanced economies. So it might be the case that we are still underestimating the gravity of the pandemic in these regions. In the case of East Asia Pacific, excluding China, caseloads stabilized recently, as I mentioned, but still there are some countries, the number of cases has been increasing recently. Let me turn to the second point I would like to make, and then I will turn to the issue of this second risk I would like to discuss. So when there are deep recessions, these deep recessions are often associated with large output losses. And these large output losses stay with these economies for an extended period of time. When you have a recession, of course, uncertainty increases, confidence collapses, investment declines dramatically. In this case, we also have this big problem with the human capital accumulation. Kids are unable to go to school in the way they used to, so their ability to acquire education at the ages they need to acquire curtailed. And given the very high level of unemployment, you have also the problem associated with loss of skills that has implications for human capital accumulation as well. Now, what happens is that when you have these types of deep episodes, the economy does not go back to pre-crisis trend level of output. This was the case when we had the 2009 global recession. The global economy did not recover in the sense that it did not recoup the losses associated with that global recession. In this case, the global recession is much deeper in 2020, and in all likelihood, these losses are going to be with us for an extended period of time. The implication is that these economies' ability to generate growth will be diminished. That manifests itself with decline in potential output. Of course, that's associated with the collapse on investment, collapse in human capital, and of course, the kind of the types of fiscal financial challenges I am going to discuss. Now, what will happen over the long term when we think about long-term growth prospects? These growth prospects have been downgraded for an extended period of time. Prior to the pandemic in 2019, we saw the lowest growth for the global economy since the global financial crisis. Of course, when we think about the long-term growth prospects, one measure of that is 10-year ahead global growth forecasts. These forecasts suggest that reasonably good growth in the 2000s. For example, in 2000, 10-year ahead growth forecasts, these forecasts are from consensus, were around 3.5%. In 2010, the number was 3.3. So when you pull a large group of forecasters and look at the kind of the average forecast, that declined in 2000s from 3.5 to 3.3. But then what happened in 2010 is quite remarkable, because every year long-term growth forecast was downgraded. In other words, people have become increasingly more pessimistic about the global economy's ability to generate growth over the long term. So in 2010, as I mentioned, the 10-year ahead growth forecast was 3.3%. In 2014, that number declined to 2.9%. In 2018, it was 2.5%, and the recent consensus forecast suggests that number is now around 2.4%. So what pandemic did basically magnified not just the short-term challenges the global economy is facing, long-term challenges as well. Now, the second important risk we should worry about is the possibility of financial stress triggered by a debt crisis amid very high debt levels. And these debt levels are going to increase in the coming years. So prior to the crisis, we already saw record levels of debt in emerging market developing economies. Of course, this year we will see a very large increase in deficits in emerging developing economies and what I call LIDCs here, low-income developing economies. And in the case of government debt levels, in both groups, emerging developing economies and LIDCs, there will be significant increases. The question is then how these economies can go back to sustainable debt levels. And this is going to be important because even if interest rates remain low, unless these economies are able to generate sufficient growth, it will be difficult for them to roll over their debt obligations year in, year out. Now, against this challenging background, let me turn to my third point about policy priorities. There, I think the short-term policy priority is clear. Policymakers need to deal with the immediate health and economic crisis. That starts with supporting healthcare systems and helping vulnerable groups and those viable corporate entities, keeping the economy functioning, keeping the economy above water. Now, at the global level, policies need to be coordinated to make sure there is a smooth flow of critical goods. And of course, in the context of the risks I mentioned, global community needs to ensure there is debt relief to the poorest emerging market developing economies. In this context, as you know, with the recommendation of G20, the international financial institutions have been implementing a debt suspension initiative for low-income countries and to basically mitigate the impact of the pandemic and letting them to allocate their expenditures to the immediate health services necessary. Now, we should all acknowledge that what countries did in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of monetary policy, were necessary. These were large-scale interventions. These interventions were absolutely critical to stabilize economies and to get ahead of the health crisis. Now, as soon as the crisis abates, policymakers need to look forward, put in place policies for sustained long-term growth. And there it's critical for them to improve fiscal and monetary policy frameworks, enhance debt and investment transparency to attract foreign investment, and then design robust financial regulation and bankruptcy procedures. The pandemic should be a teaching moment about the importance of reforms and laying the foundation for stronger growth in coming years. Now, at the global level, it's critical for countries to coordinate policies to address global challenges, including those related to public health and information transparency, including those regarding trade disputes, global trade and financial system, and of course, the risks in the context of climate change should be taken very seriously. Now, we learned that even those risks we take, low probability events, could materialize and could trigger a global recession when they materialize. I made 3 points in this short presentation. First, we are facing the deepest and most synchronized global recession since the Second World War. This is the first recession for emerging market developing economies on record. And risks are still tilted to the downside. Second, this crisis has important long-term implications. We might end up seeing much weaker potential output, investment, and productivity growth in the medium and the long term. And finally, policies can change basically the kind of the outlook we see. If policymakers are able to address the health crisis effectively, they pursue reforms to reignite growth, find ways to enhance debt and investment transparency, and of course, coordinate policies globally. Now, over the years, I have seen recessions, including some global recessions as a professional economist. And every time a global recession takes place, there are debates about the shape of the recovery. And there are many shapes proposed during recessions. I collected these basically pictures when I was working on the 2009 global recession, and people were discussing the recovery. One shape of the recovery is this V shape, a very sharp turnaround in the economy. Another shape is W. This is a double dip recession. Now, again, back to agenda because of the number of cases increasing in some countries. Some think about a U-shaped recovery. This is basically the economy goes down, activity remains weak for a while, and then comes back. I've seen arguments for an L-shaped recovery. Obviously, this is not a recovery. The economy goes down and never recovers. There is a saxophone-shaped recovery I never understood. And then, of course, there's bathtub-shaped recovery. The economy activity declines, remains weak for an extended period of time, and then suddenly shuts up. Some talked about inverse square root shaped recovery. Nowadays, there is this Z-shaped recovery and the swoosh-shaped recovery recently basically discussed by commentators. These discussions might be useful as we think about difficult concepts in terms of the trajectory of the recovery, but let's make no mistake about this episode. This is a serious recession. It will be a painful recovery. Policymakers need to undertake aggressive measures, not just for today, but for tomorrow, to make sure there is a robust recovery underway. I hope you will visit our webpage to look at our publications. We produce global economic prospects every 6 months, January and June. We have another publication, Commodity Markets Outlook, April and October. Of course, we have other publications, analytical issues we look at in the context of debt, in the context of global recessions. But let me thank you again for inviting me. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayhan-san, for a very wonderful presentation and a very sobering view about the prospects, which I think is very appropriate as there is a great uncertainty now as to how things may unfold in the global economy. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Kimura to make some comments and pose some questions to kick off the discussions. Dr. Kimura?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that talk was a sort of dismal, but very inspiring. We have to face the reality and then how we can think of the future in a constructive manner. I think the talk was a very good starting point. I think still in your presentation, you showed us some figures. Still in some developing countries, the incidence of the disease are increasing very drastically. And so first we have to contain the disease. That was the first priority. So in the past, some people claim that, say, health policy and economic policy are sort of trade-off, but it's not quite a trade-off. We really have to contain disease first. So the health policy is a sort of prerequisite to step into economic policy, I think. And also in presentation, Ayhan talked about economic contraction, which is coming. And this is going to be a really real historical level. And then how to deal with it in the short run and long run. In the short run, maybe we do not have much room for thinking of a sort of various choices we have to do in the short run, this and this. But in the long run, we have to think ahead much more seriously how to deal with that. So he talked about the sort of long-term growth forecast is coming down in the past 10 years already. And also how to set up a sort of policy priorities looking at the long run. I think this is a big challenge and we have to discuss on that. So I just want to pose some set of questions in order to digest what he talked about, particularly in the context of East Asia and the Pacific. Right. Question number one is sort of related to model setting in the forecast. I think we are gradually learning the nature of the disease this time. So probably we were a bit more optimistic in the past, but we are learning this disease and this guy is a pretty difficult one. So one thing is a sort of removal of restrictions on people's movements. After containing the disease below the level of the capacity of medical services, we have to remove the restriction on people's movements, domestically and also cross-border. But we gradually realize that it may take a lot of time to remove those restrictions. So, so if we consider this, then should we change a sort of a forecast to some extent in a kind of a negative direction? Second is that we are thinking of a sort of second waves of pandemic again. So this may change a sort of a forecast, particularly in 2021. And also here we are relatively talking about the sort of real economy side more, but how about the possibility of a collapse of financial sector or asset markets? In case of global financial crisis, the starting point was the financial sector. So this time, financial sector is relatively intact so far, but how about the possibility of the collapse of financial sector? This is a sort of related to model setting and what you would think about. I'd like to hear about that. Second is a sort of interpretation of your talk, particularly in the context of East Asia and Pacific, say production networks or global value chains, particularly in the manufacturing sector, is still very, very important. So how this crisis would affect production systems and the logistics networks. That's what we are interested in a lot. Then so far, if we look at what's going on, is that the production systems and logistics networks seems to stay almost there intact so far. So can we interpret the current situation that major difficulty is a demand shock from now on, or you would expect some substantial erosion of production system there? I think this is one important point when we talk about East Asia and Pacific. And also, what do you think of a possibility of a macroeconomic crisis in emerging markets, particularly in East Asia and Pacific? Say availability of foreign currencies may be a trigger, or long-term fiscal health, and a sort of concern of that would be a sort of a trigger. So what sort of things we have to be careful, particularly from the macro side, for East Asia and the Pacific? Then policy priorities, you showed us 4 points in summary, addressing the immediate health crisis. This is definitely, we have to do that. So it's okay. But the second one, pursuing reforms to reignite growth. This is something related to the long-term issue. What could be sort of priority areas for East Asia and the Pacific? I'd like to have your view on that. And third, enhancing debt and the investment transparency. This is particularly for the macro side, I guess. But what are the major issues in East Asia and Pacific? After global financial crisis, some macro fundamentals are getting much better in many East Asian countries. But still, this time, the shock would be very, very big. And what would be a sort of points that we have to be careful? The last point, coordinating policies globally. I think that's quite different from the global financial crisis. With global financial crisis, we had a pretty strong leadership coming from the US, but this time we do not really see this kind of movements. So I think the situation is quite different on this matter compared with the global financial crisis. So what could be a sort of effective move from the viewpoint of East Asia? Can we really strengthen some sort of regional initiatives? Is that a sort of possibility? Or how we can approach to a sort of a really global forum to emphasize strengthening this kind of coordination? So those are sort of a series of questions. I think I asked you too many questions, I guess. So I hope that you would pick up some important issues and give us some sort of answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kimura, for your comments and for your comments. And maybe I can turn the floor to Dr. KOSE for maybe initial responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kimura. I really appreciate your careful reading of our report and this very systematic set of issues you brought to the table. Obviously, these are the questions we were struggling with when we put together the report. So let me quickly go over the questions and try to address them. So the number one issue you mentioned that, it might take more time to remove these restrictions. And what will be the impact on that? And the second question, the possibility of massive second wave, what will be the impact on the forecast? And did you take into account the possibility of a collapse of financial sector? Now, yes, these are very serious risks. I tried to allude to, I mentioned two critical risks in the presentation. One is the protracted pandemic, and the second one, possibility of financial stress because of these elevated debt levels. Now, our baseline forecast, I talk about 5.2% contraction at the global level, assumes that after June, the global economy starts basically normalizing in terms of the extent of mitigation measures, in terms of activity. And I think in many parts of the world, there are signs of recovery. At the same time, as I mentioned, the pandemic is in full force. So policymakers are trying to calibrate their policies in the best way possible, trying to make sure economic activity is still alive, and while they are trying to control the pandemic with the kind of the mitigation measures as much as in place. Now, these forecasts come with very large uncertainty because of the possibility of a protracted period of pandemic or protracted period of mitigation measures being in place. If we don't have a vaccine, if we don't have a therapeutic in coming months. Now, if that scenario materializes and we see a protracted pandemic and we see a financial stress in some economies, then of course we are looking at a much worse outcome in terms of growth this year and possibly next year. We looked at a scenario that involved a protracted pandemic and the possibility of this, second wave that also could trigger financial stress episodes in different parts of the world. If that materializes, our growth forecast goes down to -8% globally. In the case of advanced economies, I mentioned this growth under the baseline -7 that declines to -10. In the case of emerging developing economies, I mentioned the baseline forecast is -2.5. That basically goes down to -5. So we are already in July. I am hoping that this the kind of the bad scenario will not materialize. But of course, we are worried about the uneven recovery as well. If you would like to see a broad-based global turnaround in activity, you need to see a global broad-based, basically, decline in numbers and a serious, basically, turnaround in terms of the direction of the pandemic. We are not there yet. And as you mentioned, we are economists. We are trying to understand the pandemic as much as we can, but even in some countries, we thought that pandemic was under control. We realized that it wasn't under control when these economies tried to open. Now, the interpretation, related questions, your second question, critical. And whether we look at a crisis, is it triggered by a demand shock? Is it triggered by a supply shock? Obviously, in this case, we have both of them in place. You have a clear supply shock because you are asking people not to work, don't go to work. And then you are disrupting cross-border trade flows for obvious reasons. And then you are creating basically demand shock as well, because people are unable to consume in the way they used to consume. So in a sense, this is double whammy. In the context of global trade and supply chains, this crisis for many countries, a kind of a call to think about basically how they are integrated in the global supply chain. We might end up seeing shortening of these supply chains, or countries trying to diversify their suppliers rather than relying on just one country. All of these things, in terms of their evolution, need to be seen. But there are serious disruptions when it comes to supply chains. As you said, the supply chains are still there, but this year we are expecting, for example, a historical contraction in global trade by about 13.4%, even larger than what we saw during the global financial crisis. So this episode will leave a lasting mark on global trade flows and the global supply chains, in the sense that even before the crisis, we saw weakening global trade flows in terms of global trade growth has been declining. And global supply chains were not growing as they used to grow. In fact, they were basically shortened. Now, possibility of macroeconomic crisis in emerging market developing economies, and in the case of East Asia Pacific, what will be the kind of the shape of that crisis? There, you really need to focus on the debt problem. Debt problem is there for the sovereign. Debt problem is there for corporates and households as well. In 2019, global debt was around 83%. In 2021, the current projections suggest global debt levels will reach 103% relative to global GDP. In the case of emerging markets, we will see close to 24 percentage points increase. Prior to the crisis, the number was 52, and after the crisis, the number will get close to 65. Now, the challenge here for emerging market developing economies is try to calibrate their policies, make sure that they have a medium-term strategy to deal with the debt problem and very large fiscal deficit. In the case of the region, East Asia Pacific region, there are challenges, but the region is in a better position than when we think about some other regions, in the sense that policy frameworks in East Asia Pacific in many countries have improved significantly over the years, especially after the Asian financial crisis. After the global financial crisis, there is a much more serious attention when it comes to stability of the financial sector, stability of the balance sheets of the corporates. This does not necessarily mean that there is no problem in the region. There are still some countries, they have sizable debt levels on the part of sovereign as well as on the part of corporates, and we need to be, carefully monitoring that. But it's going to be important for this region to continue, getting the benefits of global trade and the global financial flows as it did for an extended period of time. Another important risk in this context, of course, the trade tensions that really affected the region adversely prior to the crisis, and now escalation of the trade tensions could be another risk we should monitor in coming months. And finally, what are the kind of the policy priorities for the region? Enhancing debt and investment transparency is critical in some countries more than the others. And I think that we see basically downgrades of credit ratings of countries. Those countries that are subject to these downgrades, they need to step up their efforts in terms of how they are going to put their financial house in order. Coordinating policies globally, as you observe, this is a different period than what we had during the 2007-2009 global financial crisis. We saw synchronized policies in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of monetary policy, and overwhelming policy response at the global level. Actually, policymakers were very aggressive in terms of their responses, especially in major advanced economies, much more aggressive than what we saw during the global financial crisis. I think this crisis is a clear case in terms of for policymakers to understand the necessity for coordinating their policies above and beyond macroeconomic and financial policies. In the context of health policy, I think this crisis tells us coordination of policy is necessary when there are serious threats to global public health. Information transparency, information sharing among countries, critical to get ahead of these types of threats and making sure that they are contained, they don't turn into a pandemic. So I try to cover the questions you ask. Again, I'm very appreciative of your careful reading and providing this detailed discussion. And I look forward to other questions as we continue the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayhan-san. Dr. Kimura, do you have any responses or other questions? Follow-up questions?
No, I think he answered many questions actually. We understand. I think that the basic understanding is very much shared, I think, and we really have to think something constructive for the future. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask a few questions. I think, Ayhan-san, you said that the short-term responses by advanced countries and others seem to have been relatively good in terms of being a very good, quick, strong response to avoid a financial crisis. And also, going forward, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so in terms of the long term, as you said, this crisis seems to be a deep one, a synchronized one, being triggered by a pandemic. So also a health problem is also as important as the other response policies. So in terms of long-term policies, do you see anything that should be in the toolbox going forward, or things that countries need to keep in mind?
I think that when you basically work on policies for an extended period of time, you basically always start with the premise. There are some policies that are good, and there are some policies that are not so good. This crisis, once again, tells us something. Policymakers, when they confront a problem, they need to take the problem seriously. They cannot basically hope that the problem will take care of itself. In this case, of course, the problem is a health crisis. It will require serious, informed policy intervention, and that serious, informed policy intervention should be supported by expert views, in this case, the medical community. When you look around the world, I think that countries, in terms of their responses to the crisis, quickly realize that at the end of the day, a health crisis will require all hands on deck approach, in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of monetary policy, in terms of whatever structural support measures. And when in previous episodes we saw serious debates about the kind of the nature and the size of the intervention, at least in this case, we saw in the first step a big, serious, rapid response in many countries. And I think that's a welcome development. Now, more than the kind of the thinking about the toolbox, what policymakers need to focus on now, after, of course, making sure the pandemic is under control and the economic activity goes back to reasonable levels, they need to think about how to withdraw these extraordinary accommodation measures. And there, they need to be very, very careful, and they need to make sure, you know, the economy is stabilizing when it comes to basically the support measures. There's a clear path for sustainability of fiscal balances. There's a clear path to exit from this extraordinary accommodation. Now, I think when we think about long-term policies, this crisis shows us how important to have a resilient healthcare system, resilient safety nets for those vulnerable parts of the society. And hopefully policymakers will learn from this teachable moment and undertake the measures necessary to improve the kind of the health service, to improve the kind of the social safety net. So when they face the next crisis, whether it's a large one or a small one, they're able to mobilize the resources. We see around the world, some countries are in much better shape in terms of their response to the crisis, and some other countries really struggle on the health dimension. And one reason for that is the lack of, health services, lack of beds, lack of doctors, nurses. So all of these things will require serious interventions in coming years. In some countries, especially in low-income countries, simply the resources are not there. It means global community needs to provide the kind of the necessary support. At the end of the day, in this day and age, it's impossible to contain these problems within borders. Countries can try to turn their back to issues in other countries, but we know that those issues sooner or later become global issues and become problems for the global community. Let's hope that these lessons are taken by policymakers and noted, and they will implement the necessary responses.
I have a follow-up question to Dr. Kimura's second question. I think if this current crisis in terms of demand is of course very big, but if we think it as a simple problem, then if demand comes back, then the production process will kick back in. But if, as you said, maybe if it's a protracted kind of problem, then there is an issue of the production chain kind of disintegrating. And this may also be related to your issue about education. There's going to be maybe some gaps in the education of a certain, generation. How do you see countries putting into place these policies going forward?
So the policies in the context of education are critical. I think that we always know these types of deep recessions translate into challenges, and those challenges are not constrained with 1 year or 2 years. In this particular episode, the fact that we have a kind of a problem in terms of teaching school-age kids, in terms of kids getting the type of education they used to get under normal circumstances, it would have a kind of a cascading impact when we think about their lack of access to type of, you know, education they used to have. And different countries would approach the problem differently. The issue is that whatever that erosion of human capital, especially that erosion of human capital is critical at early ages, you would like to make sure, you know, you take measures. So there is ample opportunity for kids to cover the ground and catch up to the kind of the curriculum they should be at the level. And now there are serious discussions how to basically undertake, you know, the kind of the normal face-to-face education. And those discussions require serious thinking, the informed opinions from the medical community and teachers and educators around the world. We on the ground at the World Bank are working with our member countries to provide the best advice. Here, of course, these digital technologies are critical. No one can say that they are the kind of the solutions, but providing the necessary access to technology is utmost importance nowadays. In some households, you have only one cell phone or one computer and multiple kids. So we need to find ways that these the households have the necessary equipment, so kids can at least get the education digitally and have the access to kind of the internet and the web to be able to, you know, cover the ground while staying away from school. Once again, I think that it boils down to the bigger challenges of inequality and the bigger challenges of inequality of opportunity, and the policymakers thinking through these issues in coming months. I don't think these issues are issues we can quickly fix, especially in low-income countries. They will require serious resources, serious reforms. Every crisis, as much as brings significant pain, also brings significant opportunities. Our hope is that this crisis will be an opportunity to transform how we think about education and broaden the base of the education and provide higher quality education using digital means as well. These are much easier said than done, but hopefully we can build on this experience. And I look forward to hearing Dr. Kimura's views on these issues as well.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much. I think your message that we need to think about not only the sobering kind of risks, but also look at the opportunities, I think is well taken. I think we are running out of time somewhat. So maybe I would like to ask Dr. Kimura to give some final comments. And then maybe after that, ask Ayhan-san to make some final comments. Dr. Kimura?
Thank you. I think the report was very successful in quantifying the seriousness of this crisis, and also what to be a sort of things in the short run and the long run from the viewpoint of emerging economies. I think the report is a very important one, and then I really appreciate a good presentation today, and how we digest those kind of key messages in the context of East Asia and the Pacific. That's our homework. So we will continue working on that. Thank you very much.
Dr. KOSE?
Thank you, Dr. Kimura. Let me end with a positive note. Obviously, this is a difficult period. And as I said, we should not try to sugarcoat anything here. We should be basically frank in our assessment. And let's hope our assessment is not correct. Things turn out much better than what we are hoping. I think we should all understand the kind of opportunity here. We were thinking that we will have a technological transformation 3 to 5, 10 years in the coming decade. Probably because of this episode, that technological transformation is taking place in a much shorter time period. And maybe that is the silver lining of this episode. And I think if we are able to use the technology effectively, make sure greater number of people around the world, especially those vulnerable segments of the society, able to participate in the use of technology, there could be better outcomes associated with this crisis. You might see a productivity surge, and hopefully because of that productivity surge, we will see much better growth prospects, and forecasters become more optimistic about the future rather than increasingly pessimistic. I think whenever these types of crises take place, we would like to remember that the history is watching, and how policymakers will respond will determine how the history of this episode will be written. And let's hope that policymakers are going to respond in the way we are hoping. And let's hope that this crisis will be an opportunity for technological transformation. I think that will be a good outcome, and that will be the the hopeful outcome. With that, let me thank you again, RIETI, and let me thank you, Dr. Kimura and Osamu, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for very, very wonderful presentation again. So very sobering, and need to think through about the uncertainty, but also to need to have optimism going forward. Thank you very much for that.